So welcome to this webinar. We're really delighted to sponsor this webinar today. I'm Joanne Cashman from the IDA Partnership at the National Association of State Directors of Special Education. And we're joined here by our friends from the Justice Center at the Council of State Governments, who you're going to meet in just a few minutes. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of introduction to the groups that are sponsoring. The partnership is an investment by the Office of Special Education Programs, and we affiliate over 50 national organizations around the things that they care about. And one of the things that they care about is school behavioral health. And of course, you can make that logical connection to today's topic of discipline and school behavioral health. We have a national community of practice on school behavioral health that currently affiliates 12 states, 18 national organizations, and 7 federally funded technical assistance centers. So their reach is pretty broad and pretty deep into the individuals that work at the decision maker level, at the practitioner level, at the community level, at the family and youth level. And we've reached out to all of them today and encourage them to invite people to come to this discussion to really have a dialogue around some of the issues, and then really kind of go on to see what it is we might do to ask you to continue this dialogue with those that are in your own individual networks. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn it over to Nina, and she will introduce herself and her colleagues and a little bit about the work, and we'll get started. Nina?
Great. Thank you so much, Joanne, and to Mariola and everyone at the IDA Partnership for hosting this webinar with us and inviting us to present to you all. I'm Nina Solomon. I work at the Council of State Governments Justice Center here in the DC office. And my colleague, Emily Morgan, is also on the line, and she's in our New York office, and you'll be hearing from her as well. So just quickly, just to go through who we are and who the Council of State Governments is. We're a national nonprofit, nonpartisan association representing state government officials from all 3 branches, so from the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. And we provide advice informed by the best available evidence and best practices on a range of policy issues, primarily around juvenile and criminal justice and the issues that intersect with those systems. And so before we get started, we would like to know who we have on the line. And so I think we have our first poll question, if you see on your screen. What is your primary role or position? So if you all could take a moment and just identify who you are and who you represent, we can get started.
And just wanted to let you know that there are a number of different roles that you can choose from. And if they're all not displayed on your screen, which they probably are not, just scroll down and choose from among the roles that are listed. So let's take a look at that. From the polling results, and I hope most of you have had a chance to do that now, we closed that poll, and it surely looks like most of the people on the call identify themselves as school behavioral health specialists. But we do have an array of people from different roles. Although we're not equally represented, we have a really good distribution of roles on the call, with the majority describing themselves as behavioral health specialists. So that's great. Should make for an interesting conversation.
Great, and I know others will be joining us throughout the call as well, and look forward to hearing from everybody at the end for discussion. So one of the first questions that we always got at the Justice Center was, why are we focusing on school discipline? And what do we know about school discipline around the country, and how did this inform our work in this area? So we know that suspending and expelling kids across the country has become commonplace, with millions of kids being suspended from school nationally for very minor misbehavior, what we call discretionary offenses. We also know the relationship between suspensions and expulsions and student outcomes, and that the majority of these kids fall behind academically and end up dropping out of school and also becoming more likely to be involved in the juvenile justice system. As you can see on the slide, that 3.5 million are estimated to be suspended in school on an annual basis, with 3.3 million out-of-school suspensions nationally. So one of the reasons that we decided to become involved on this issue was that policymakers in Texas were really concerned with the number of students that were being referred to the juvenile justice system, particularly from schools for school-based offenses. And so the Justice Center really sought out to examine this issue, first primarily in Texas, and then to extrapolate those results nationally. So about 3 or 4 years ago, the Justice Center embarked on a national or a Texas-based study, statewide study, on school discipline, looking at school discipline rates and what these rates, how they determine student outcomes. And what the study found, and it followed about 1 million kids throughout the state of Texas from 7th grade through 12th grade, was that nearly 60% of all middle and high school students experienced suspension at least one time during their middle and high school years. We also found that 15% of all students during those years were disciplined 11 or more separate times. So 15% of all students in the state of Texas between 7th grade and 12th grade had at least one disciplinary action, whether that was an in-school or out-of-school suspension or an expulsion. And so given the scope of this work, we wanted to examine this a little bit further. And so we disaggregated the data, and we saw that, not surprisingly, that school discipline rates had a disproportionate impact on students of color. So not just in the Texas study, but when you look at the Office of Civil Rights data, which this slide presents, you can see that over the last 3 or 4 decades, not just the number of suspensions increased tremendously, but also the disproportionate impact. And you can see the disciplinary suspension rates there by student subgroups. And obviously you can see the rate of suspensions for black students compared to those of their white peers. Also, Latino students are disproportionately impacted by suspension and expulsion rates. When we looked at the data further, we also saw not just a disproportionate impact on students of color, but a disproportionate impact on students with disabilities, particularly those students with emotional disturbances under IEDA, and then most impactfully, we can see it on black males with disabilities, and you can see the rates on your screen as well, disaggregated by not just race, but also by gender. So one of the reasons that we sought out to examine the issue of school discipline was its relationship to a number of other outcomes that policymakers and practitioners are interested in. So one is just to create environments that are welcoming and supportive for students to make them feel engaged in the classroom and in school. Another area that's really important to policymakers and practitioners that we hear a lot about is closing the achievement gap between students of color and their white peers. Also improving high school graduation rates and reducing the number of children who are facing incarceration and being placed in detention facilities or in juvenile justice facilities. And so we wanted to study, and this is, we'll get into the consensus project, we wanted to look at what the scope of the problem was and what are some policy and practice recommendations that the field can agree on to solve this problem. We also saw a number of school districts and states in recent years really taking action, implementing changes to their school district codes of conduct, states taking action on passing new legislation, eliminating zero tolerance, and we also saw a number of states implementing legislation to improve their school climate, whether that's through data collection, through restorative justice, or through other practices. And so as you can see on this slide, over a dozen of the big city school districts around the country have overhauled their school codes of conduct in recent years. We've heard about Baltimore, we've heard about LA Unified, which removed willful defiance as a reason for suspensions and expulsions. We also know that at least 8 states in the last couple of years in their legislative sessions have passed legislation to improve school discipline, some requiring additional data collection on school discipline indicators, some completely eliminating zero tolerance policies, and then we see 13 states that have statutes currently that are directing schools to improve school climate. And as a result of these changes in policies and practices, we see school districts and systems around the country that are making improvements. So this slide shows how in New York City, the student suspension rates have dropped just in a single school year. And we also know this to be the case in Baltimore, LA, and Denver, and as well as a number of other districts that have implemented changes in the last few years. And all of these districts, while they've made a number of they've made a lot of progress, they all recognize that there's still a long way to go, particularly in reducing disparities and disproportionate impact. So with that, I just want to turn to Emily so we can go through an overview of the School Discipline Consensus Project and the report that was recently released in June. Emily, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me now?
There she
Yep.
is. Yeah,
We can
great,
hear you.
Emily.
Sorry about that. Great. So what we're here today to talk about is the new report that we released in June around policy and practice recommendations for improving school discipline systems. And as you may know, this is a kind of hot button topic in recent months and years. And there have been some reports that have come out recently, some data that's been released by the Department of Education and other research bodies. But our report is really unique for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's field-driven and practical. So the guidance provided in the report is grounded in real-world approaches that were identified through extensive outreach to practitioners and policymakers alike serving youth. It's also consensus-based. So as Nina mentioned, this report is the result of a nearly 3-year consensus project, which brought together over 100 advisors representing the fields of education, law enforcement, behavioral health, child welfare, juvenile justice, as well as students, families, and community partners. So the report represents or reflects consensus among all these individuals, kind of where they agree are the places where changes can be made to improve school discipline. It's also extremely comprehensive. The report is over 400 pages, provides over 24 policy statements and approximately 60 recommendations for improving school discipline systems. And doesn't look at just one narrow lens of school discipline, but looks at issues across the spectrum that are of interest to multiple groups. So the report and the consensus project itself was funded through a very impressive public-private partnership, including the Department of Education and Justice, as well as some private foundations. And what we want to do now is just kind of run through the recommendations and kind of provide you with an overview of the recommended policy and practice changes that are included in the report, with a particular focus on conditions for learning and targeted behavioral interventions, which are probably of most interest to most of the folks on the line today. So the Conditions for Learning chapter focuses on creating welcoming and secure learning environments as a strategy for preventing minor misbehavior from escalating, and also improving educators' ability to manage student behavior. So we start by talking about the need to collect and review school climate data. So in order to make any changes or develop strategies for improvement, you kind of have to know where you are. And so the recommendations include processes for collecting both stakeholder perception data through surveys or focus groups, as well as combining that with school discipline data to get a more comprehensive picture of what's happening at the school level. And this data can be used not only to inform school improvement efforts, but also at the district and state level to identify schools that may not be creating the environments that we want for our students. Then the report goes on to talk about the need to examine this data with a broad range of stakeholders to improve transparency and also to get more buy-in for the recommended improvements, with a particular focus on examining data for disproportionality and holding those difficult conversations about what might be contributing to those discrepancies. Then, based on that data, the report goes on to talk about developing a comprehensive plan for improving school climate. And the report focuses on 5 specific strategies to do this, recognizing that there are a multitude of different strategies that can be used to improve school climate. We thought that most of them kind of fell into these 5 buckets. So the first being creating positive relationships among students and adults in the school building. And we provide different strategies for educators and administrators to develop these trusting and respectful relationships with their students to ensure they feel secure and comfortable in the learning environment. Another strategy is to develop shared expectations for behavior, and this is where the students really develop the expectations alongside the educators, so that there's an understanding of what's appropriate behavior, what the penalties or what the consequences will be if those behaviors are not adhered to, and students feel really bought into the system, and that there's a graduated system for kind of consequences. A third strategy is providing engaging instruction that's developmentally appropriate, student-centered, evidence-based, grounded in a real-world context, kind of all of those aspects of instruction that we know should be there in order to ensure students are feeling challenged but also supported. Fourth strategy is promoting family and community involvement and really meeting families on their terms. You know, a lot of parents work, a lot of parents have other responsibilities, and so figuring out those ways to enable parents and family members to be involved in their students' education is another strategy that we talk about. And fifth, we talk about addressing aspects of the school building. So not only ensuring that the school building is safe, but also talking about how the actual building feels when you walk into it. So are lockers broken? Are windows broken? Is there graffiti on the walls? And also about creating places where students can get together and work collaboratively. We then talk about codes of conduct. And while they're most often developed at the district, there's also state guidelines for kind of behavior and conduct, especially around maximum days of suspension and expulsion, data collection, and so on. And we really want to make sure that they ensure that they reflect and reinforce positive school climate. So the first step, we recommend that communities examine state laws and regulations and ensure they provide a foundation for schools and districts to develop effective codes of conduct. We also recommend that communities bring stakeholders together to review the code of conduct to ensure that it's consistent with their views of conditions for learning and ensure disciplinary policies address concerns that are raised by different groups. Another recommendation is around the design of a graduated system of developmentally appropriate responses to misconduct that keep students in school when possible, but also hold them accountable for their behavior. So we talk a lot about restorative justice and restorative practices, and really ensuring that the response to the behavior matches the actual behavior itself. Then when students do engage in misbehavior or need a timeout or need to step away from the environment that's escalating, we talk about creating a space on school campus for students who are receiving disciplinary actions where they can go and continue to receive educational services, but also be supported and have opportunities to talk about what happened and receive kind of behavioral and social emotional support. We also talk about due process and what are students' rights in different circumstances. So if they are facing removal, kind of information that parents and students should have at hand to be advocates for themselves and make sure that their rights aren't being violated. And then finally talk about the professional development that's necessary to ensure a common understanding of the code of conduct by educators, by students, by parents and family members, all across the board, so that there's no confusion on what constitutes a behavior that would result in suspension. And finally, talk about professional development and training for educators to ensure that they're able to carry out some of the strategies to improve school climate. We talk about ensuring educators that are currently working in schools ensure they have the tools and training to create positive school climate. We also talk about pre-service training for educators for folks who want to become educators and providing them with the training that they need around social emotional learning, around school climate, around conditions for learning, to make sure that they're able then, once they're in the classroom, to put those skills into practice. And as you all know, what's really important at the school level, not only are the teachers who can create these positive environments, but also the school building leader or school principal. And so we have some information there about ways to ensure that principals are kind of setting the stage and creating a positive learning environment both for their staff and also for the students and their families. And then we also talk about ways to monitor educators and administrator progress implementing strategies to improve the classroom environment. So our second chapter focuses on targeted...
Sorry, Emily, I just want to say one thing. I think everyone are a little confused about the slides changing. We have one slide per chapter of the report, but Emily is going in more depth than is on each of the slides. Just so you all know, all these recommendations and all the information is available in the report and the executive summary. We just didn't want to overload the slides. So just so you all know, we are using one slide per chapter. Sorry, go ahead.
Great. Yeah, we just wanted to kind of provide a little bit more information about the first two chapters that seem to be most relevant to the folks on the phone given the polling questions. So the next chapter focuses on targeted behavioral interventions, recognizing that there are going to be some students for whom positive school climate and the right conditions for learning are not sufficient to keep them in class and out of the school discipline system. And many of these students may have unmet behavioral health needs. And so what can we do to support these students and ensure that they are able to stay in the classroom and receive the services and supports that they need? So we start by talking about a way to identify and tailor responses for those students with more behavioral health needs. And one way of doing this is through an early warning system. So a lot of school districts are implementing early warning systems for dropout prevention, looking at certain academic indicators and attendance. And we recommend incorporating behavioral indicators into those early warning systems so that they can become more comprehensive and not only identify students at risk of dropping out of school early, but also identify students who may be at risk of suspension or expulsion early. We also want to expand current early warning systems that kind of focus on more deficit or have more of a deficit focus and include more kind of positive behaviors. So for example, self-awareness, self-regulation, positive outlook on things, relationships with supportive adults, kind of those strengths-based indicators that can show students and help demonstrate students with more needs than others. We also then talk about conducting assessments to better understand the prevalence of behavioral health needs and other risk factors of students and gather information about community and school resources to address these. So whether it's through a survey, through focus groups, or through other means, helping the school and administrator first figure out students' behavioral health needs. A lot of places are doing this. One example is the California Healthy Kids Survey to figure out kind of what's going on with individual students and where the needs are, and then also mapping what resources are available both at the school level and then also looking outside the school to what community resources are available to help match kids with those resources. And then once a school has determined the needs and the resources, helping them develop a plan. And what we're recommending and what a lot of schools and districts have implemented are student support teams. So they're kind of multidisciplinary teams that help figure out kind of which students need what types of supports and match them with those services and interventions. And so the report goes into detail on who should be on the team, what the role and responsibilities are of those team members, and what are the necessary resources for them to carry out the tasks at hand. The report also goes into the types of interventions that should be applied to students with more intensive behavioral health needs, applying a systems of care approach so that it's, again, not only the school's responsibility, but it's also taking into account other community resources that can really help expand the options available. And finally, while we emphasize throughout the whole report that suspension and expulsion should only be used as a last resort, there are going to be those students who need to be removed from the school. And so this chapter also discusses strategies for ensuring those students removed from campus for disciplinary reasons are provided with access to high quality education, alternative education services, and that there's a continuum of multiple pathways for students who aren't succeeding in traditional classrooms, and kind of what that should look like. So our third chapter focuses on school-police partnerships and what communities can do through school-police partnerships to keep all students in safe and productive learning environments. So the first step is to determine what is the most appropriate school-police partnership for that particular community. And we recognize that not every community is going to need or want or be able to have a police partnership, but we also recognize that there are many that do, and so this chapter provides a decision-making tool to help walk schools and partners through the process of determining the most appropriate partnership. And it also provides examples of school police partnership models to help communities decide what would work best for their particular circumstances. The chapter also goes on to discuss policies and procedures to ensure law enforcement is not called on to respond to minor student misconduct. And that's always a huge concern, as we found out and knew from our discussions with practitioners and our advisory group members. This constantly came up, is how do you ensure that officers aren't being called into school to respond to minor codes of conduct violations. And so we provide guidance in this chapter around how to ensure policies clearly define officers' roles and when they should be called into school campuses, to train teachers, administrators, and other staff and police about when and how to involve officers in school-related matters. And also to collect and analyze data on how often officers are being called in and for what offenses and what situations to ensure school and police personnel are adhering to policies regarding the involvement of officers. And a fundamental kind of piece of the effective school police partnerships is the officers themselves. So a large part of this chapter is dedicated to how officers are recruited and selected and ensuring that they're well suited for the position, talking about how they're trained and how they're supervised to ensure that they're carrying out their responsibilities effectively. And then it also focuses on establishing formal written agreements to solidify roles and responsibilities of officers working in schools. So examining legal issues and information sharing principles, and ensuring all of those things are worked out between the school and the law enforcement agency well in advance of the officer actually being put into the school building. And our final chapter focuses on courts and juvenile justice. And basically helps provide some strategies to keep students who commit minor offenses at school from being referred to courts. And again, I think you'll see that this theme comes up again and again in our report, is the need to collect data. And so the first piece of this is monitoring how many students are being referred to court from schools. And most places can't provide that type of data. And so we're proposing and recommending that that data does become available so that educators and police officials have a better sense of what that pipeline actually looks like, and then can use that data to identify schools that are disproportionately referring students to court, and can implement some interventions to ensure that that's not happening and to minimize referrals to court for minor offenses. Then if certainly there will be some students who need or who become involved in the juvenile justice system or who find themselves in court. And so we provide examples and strategies and suggestions in this chapter around diversion. We talk about school-based diversion in the conditions for learning chapter on ways schools can divert students from being suspended, such as restorative justice. And here we look at the court role. So what options should be available to juvenile justice officials to limit the number of students formally processed, particularly for minor offenses? And what tools can be used to determine what students are low risk and what options should be available to juvenile justice officials to limit the number of students involved in the system. The chapter goes on to talk about when youth are under juvenile corrections supervision, we want to make sure that they have the same access to high-quality learning environments. So the chapter provides recommendations on how to ensure schools within juvenile justice correctional facilities are integrated into the system's education system and provide safe, engaging learning environments for students. So making sure that students in correctional facilities have the same access to the high-quality facilities that students otherwise would. And then once students are released from correctional facilities, how to make sure that their transition is supported back to their mainstream education system and ensure that they resume school as soon as possible after their release. So again, that's just a kind of broad-based overview of the 4 chapters of the report, but there is an executive summary on our website, and the full report is also available on our website. So we really encourage you to take a look to see the strategies and recommendations in more detail.
Great. And so before we go to the next section on how to get started with all of these recommendations, we have another polling question. So we'd like to hear from you all. I think you can see it on your screen. Does your school district, organization, or I guess state agency, if that's who you represent, do you have a working group that's established to focus on reducing suspensions and expulsions? So we'll give you all just a moment to complete that polling question. Okay. So it looks like the poll is closed, and it looks like by a slight majority, most of you have a working group, or about half actually have a working group that's established at your school district or organizational level to focus on school discipline and suspensions and expulsions, and about, another half or a little less than a half either don't have one or are working on establishing one. So it looks like more than half actually either have one or are working on establishing a working group. So it looks like a good majority are focusing on these issues and prioritizing this, which is really great to hear. So the next polling question is for those of you who answered yes, or that you're working on establishing a working group, what is that working group's primary focus? And so we have a list of different potential areas of interest or areas to examine, and with also an option for all of the above if your working group is planning to address all of these issues. So please take a moment and just let us know what your working group will be focusing on or is currently focusing on in the school discipline realm. So we're going to close the poll. It looks like a lot of folks are working on implementing restorative justice practices or other strategies to improve school climate, as well as revising the code of conduct, which is a trend that we've seen around the country in a number of school districts and jurisdictions. Also with a few folks working on closing disproportionate impact and addressing disparities, which is great as well, with a few other folks working on some of the other issues. So in this next section, we really want to talk about how to get started. Emily provided a fantastic overview of the 4 chapters and the 60 recommendations that we provide. And we know that it can be a little bit overwhelming. And so one of the first questions that people ask us after seeing the report is, how do we get started? And so this is really just us providing our thoughts on how we see states and local jurisdictions really working on tackling these issues and implementing some of the recommendations in the report, because we understand that it's impossible to tackle everything at once. And so the first thing that we see is for folks to assemble all their critical stakeholders. So we need to have the right people engaged in these conversations and the right people around the table. And as you can see on this slide, that includes behavioral health professionals, that includes educators and administrators, that includes court officials, juvenile justice officials, police, line-level officers, as well as police leaders, folks from probation, as well as families and youth we feel are critical to involve in these conversations to address school discipline, to examine the issue of disparities, and also to develop solutions to the identified needs. So as Emily mentioned, throughout the report, we talk about examining data. We talk about examining school climate data. We talk about looking at juvenile justice referral data, arrest data, et cetera. And we want to have this data disaggregated so that we really know what's going on at a campus level, at a district level, and at the state level. And so as this slide shows, the majority of states right now publicly report some school discipline data on their agency website. So this is just publicly available data. So states could be collecting this data but not making it publicly available on their websites. Of the 41 states that publicly report some school discipline data, 22 states provide information on the number of students that are suspended annually. And of those states, 17 states actually disaggregate this data by race on their agency website. Most often, these are on the state education agency website. And in the data collection chapter in the report, we talk about what data we feel should be collected at the state level and should be publicly reported at the state level. And so these next slides show you what data is currently collected and publicly reported at each of these different levels. So as the first slide shows, approximately 50% of states report total counts of in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension by offense types, so by what the student actually did to receive that disciplinary action. Just over 40% of states report the number of students suspended annually. So this is different than total counts, as this is unduplicated. And we really think this is vitally important because, as we saw even in the Texas study, where 15% of students received 11 or more disciplinary actions, we know that that students are receiving multiple disciplinary actions. And we want to know if there's certain individuals that are receiving more of these actions than others, and not just the total count of suspensions and expulsions. About 1/3 of states disaggregate this data by student race and ethnicity and publish this on their state education agency website, so publicly report data by student subgroups. And about 20% of states report school climate or campus arrest data. So as Emily mentioned, the majority of states are currently not collecting or not publicly reporting data on school climate indicators, or through school climate surveys of parents, students, educators, et cetera, or campus arrest data and referrals to the juvenile justice system, which we think is really, really important to really get a better understanding of what's happening at the campus and district levels. So what we're thinking of, and what we've been talking to states and districts about in recent months since the release of the report, is how having this data available in a really comprehensive way is critical. And it provides policymakers, it provides practitioners, educators, behavioral health specialists, all folks that work in a school building working with youth on these issues. It provides them an opportunity to make comparisons between districts and between schools. And that helps not just identify those schools and those districts that are struggling with these issues, but it also helps identify those schools that are doing really, really well at addressing disparities, at reducing the number of suspensions and expulsions. And that really allows districts to scale up those best practices, to really look at those schools that are doing well and see what practices, what policies they have in place that are allowing them to succeed in this regard. And it allows them to take those practices and policy changes and try to scale them up across the district or across the state. Also, we know that it's not the goal of reducing, or the goal of addressing school discipline is not just to reduce numbers. It's not just to reduce the number of suspensions. It's not just to reduce the number of expulsions. We know that there's important relationships between school discipline and other important outcomes that we want to see for youth and for schools. Do students feel safer in school? Do they feel more welcome and supported? Do we put them in a position to succeed and feel engaged in the classroom? So we want to know, does the rate of school discipline have a relationship with attendance rates, with academic achievement, with rates of school safety and rates of crime or criminal incidents in school buildings? Because we know just because the number of suspensions decreases in a school, that does not automatically mean that a school is doing better academically or that students feel safer and more supported. It could just imply that there's a more chaotic learning environment or that certain group of students are just not coming to school anymore. So we really want to delve deeper and look at the relationship between school discipline rates and other important indicators or measures of success for students. And so we're really thinking about developing a comprehensive system that not just provides this data and lets districts and states compare data, but also allows them to determine relationships between the data and other important indicators. And so, as Emily mentioned, the report is available on our website, as is the executive summary. We also have a couple different supplementary tools that we've developed with more on the way. We have an implementation checklist for school district superintendents and administrators that allows them to assess where they are on current policies and practices aligned with the report, as well as guide their process for identifying their needs and priorities and developing action steps. We also have a funding chart on our website that depicts different federal funding opportunities to support school climate, behavioral health, and school safety. And we'll also be developing a couple other tools, one particularly for educators and school-based leaders to help them with the implementation of the report and let them see how they can be involved in making these important decisions in the school building and in the classroom. So now I just want to open it up for questions and for discussion. I know a lot of folks that are participating are particularly interested in the behavioral health space because they are behavioral health specialists in schools, but we really want to talk comprehensively about how you all see these recommendations being implemented, and obviously we'll take questions as well about the different recommendations in the report. So I know we already have some questions in this chat window. So one of the questions is on, when referring to suspension, do we mean out-of-school suspensions only, or do we also mean in-school suspensions? So we mean both. We have a whole section in the report in the Conditions for Learning chapter that talks about in-school suspensions and how to make in-school suspensions more supportive and effective for students. So the need to have quality educators in this, and how to develop redirection rooms or planning centers, as some districts are now calling them, how it's important to have the students' work follow them to their in-school suspension space so that they don't lose valuable class time and credits and so forth. So when we refer to suspensions, we mean both in school and out of school. And when we talk about the data, there are certain states that disaggregate that data and report the number of in-school suspensions and the number of out-of-school suspensions, and there's some states that don't, and then they combine that data. So it really is a state-by-state basis on how that data is being collected and reported. Trying to look for other questions.
Do you want to just, if you want to take a minute now and type your questions into the chat, we can take some of those directly. And I see that Pam is typing now, so we'll look forward to getting that question. In the meantime, I'd like to actually pose two things. First of all, Mariola put into the chat as we were going through this a tool that you may want to access as you think about who the stakeholders are. Many of the people on the line have been invited by organizations that have been working together over a number of years around school behavioral health. And one of the things that that we know is that far too often when individuals are starting to take a look at this problem, they bring in the same group of people over and over again. And one of the things that we have been encouraging is to really look at the landscape of this issue. So get the, everybody knows what we mean by the lay of the land. So if you get the lay of the land, you're sort of getting the whole picture of this. And of all the issues that we deal with, this is one of the most important, to get the whole picture. So understanding who all those stakeholders are is quite important. And Mariola put some tools that organizations have been working on together, kind of a message straight from the stakeholders on, how they would like to be engaged. I think Mariola went to the tool to show you. Okay, so there it is. You can see it's completely written by the stakeholders, a little bit on the technical side of this work, and a lot more on the adaptive side of this work, or what we mean by adaptive is the human side of this work, both of which are quite important in making sustainable progress. So we invite you to take a look at that. Hope it's useful to you, actually implementing some of the suggestions that we heard today. The other thing I really wanted to focus on, which struck me, and I'll just start while we're waiting for some of these other questions to come in, is the relationship between schools and the police. I think this chapter adds a much added dimension from my perspective on some of this, and actually really points us to another whole group of stakeholders which too often are forgotten as we begin to look at this. For some of you that work in smaller towns, your local magistrate can be a great ally, or really someone who, by their lack of involvement, ends up being a barrier. So, this is a group that we really have been focusing on in trying to help people understand who else needs to be involved in this conversation, who needs to be considered as we start to put together those circles, concentric circles of people who are very closely connected, and then as those circles go out, who else needs to be involved, maybe more loosely, but definitely connected. So I see we have a couple questions here. So Nina, do you want to take some of those?
Sure. Yeah, before I go, I see a couple questions that were inserted into the chat box. I just want to address your point on the school police partnerships chapter and the need for having those folks at the table in these conversations. And I think one of the really unique parts of this report is in that chapter, especially in the first recommendation, where we provide a decision-making tool that we hope that not just police leaders and educators use or administrators use to determine the most appropriate police partnership for that unique district or jurisdiction, that we hope creates a working group or a sort of stakeholder team that really examines the data in that particular district or jurisdiction. So that's school climate data, that's behavioral health data, that's incident data as well, looking at not just in the school but also off campus. That's engaging folks in conversations and interviews and surveys, and really looking at what people feel are the needs of that environment before determining what police partnership is appropriate. So in that chapter, we're saying it may not be necessary that you have a school-based school resource officer on campus at all times. It may just be that you need a partnership with a police department for critical incidents or for emergency situations. But we really ask schools, districts, local agencies, community leaders, police agencies, behavioral health specialists to come together, examine that data together, and really look at what the needs are before just embarking on that process. We also know that, since the Newtown tragedy, a lot of folks have been asking these questions about, is it counselors or is it school resource officers? Is it school psychologists? And we don't think we think it's a both and situation. We think that those different stakeholders or different people play different roles in a school environment and play different roles in students' lives. And we think that you should examine the data and really look at what your needs and goals are before you determine how you're staffing and allocating your resources.
Yeah, it's a very important point. Yeah, and whenever there is only one option, it tends to be overused. So this idea of putting together a continuum that's informed by all the stakeholders and what they know, what they're willing to do, is really great. Great that this report brings attention to that. I see a couple of other questions here. Brian?
So yeah, Brian's question, can you give examples of effective programs used as alternative suspension programming? So I know in the Conditions for Learning chapter, and I think Emily can talk more about that in terms of specific places, we do talk about certain districts. I believe Cleveland is one of them, where they've developed these student planning centers to support students who receive in-school suspensions so that they could reduce the number of out-of-school suspensions and keep students in school whenever possible. Emily, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about what Cleveland's doing.
Sure. I mean, as Nina mentioned, Cleveland and Baltimore and some other districts are doing these alternative to in-school suspension places where basically it's rethinking in-school suspension to provide an environment where students can go cool off, have a person that they can talk to one-on-one to kind of vent about the incident and kind of get to the underlying and root causes of some of their behaviors while also receiving instruction and not kind of falling behind in their academic studies. But some other effective approaches are in the restorative justice or restorative practices kind of wheelhouse. And so things like peer courts have been effective and peer-led mediation, adult-led mediation, and others kind of focusing on those restorative principles where students acknowledge their behavior, take responsibility, and the student who kind of engaged in the misbehavior and the person who is affected by that behavior kind of come together and agree on a response that's reflective of the actual incident and repairs relationships, addresses the harm that was caused and so on and so forth. So those are some of the kind of strategies that seem to be working. And then I see Geraldine has a question on what are recommendations for the use of school resource officers and suspected substance abuse among students? Are there recommendations for diversion programs or graduated responses? So in the School Police Partnerships chapter, as well as in the Targeted Behavioral Interventions chapter, we talk about this issue, and we talk about it in this way. So when we refer to school resource officers and what their roles and responsibilities are, we make sure to recommend that school resource officers are not there to monitor minor student misbehavior. They're really there to provide a supportive environment for students that's secure and safe. They're really there to develop positive relationships with youth. But then if the school resource officer has a good relationship with youth and suspects these types of actions among students, then there's a student support team in place that they can go to. And it's really the student support team's responsibility to identify those students that have particular behavioral health needs, including substance abuse needs, and to develop a course of action for that student. So that's monitoring the data, prescribing interventions,
monitoring progress, and really tracking to see how that student is doing. So we don't see the school resource officer really playing a role in that, except for referring that student to appropriate services and to the student support team who really has more of the expertise around behavioral health and those types of interventions. Trying to look at the other question.
I think Paula is asking about the recommendations and the attention to the multiple players in any particular situation, not just the individual who is acting out, but also those that are affected by it. And so maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, I think in the Conditions for Learning chapter, as Emily mentioned, the emphasis is really on creating a welcoming and supportive environment for all students. So we obviously don't recommend, keeping a student in the classroom if it affects the learning environment for the rest of the kids in the classroom, but we really want to make sure that students are not being kicked out of the classroom or pushed out of school for these minor behavioral issues that can be addressed in other ways. And so we want to focus on keeping that kid in the classroom whenever possible. However, in the Conditions for Learning chapter, we talk about creating an environment that's engaging, that's challenging for all students. And as a result, if you create that kind of school climate, if you create that kind of school culture, you're promoting better behavior from students as well as better management and responses from educators. So that's really the focus of that chapter, is not just on individual students, but how can we create an environment in the classroom and in the school at large for all students to feel safe, welcome, and supportive. And then we'll see the number of referrals or suspensions or expulsions go down as a result of those policies and practices.
I would also say, Nina, I think I heard you say that in the chapter that includes restorative justice strategies, a lot of that is seems to be, from what you described, a focus on all the individuals, and surely things like mediation, peer juries, really would have attention to both, or however many individuals seem to be involved in the issue.
Exactly. I think restorative practices in general involve both parties and all the students that are affected by a particular incident.
Yeah, so Paula, if that answers your question, if not, just keep cueing us here that we need to focus a little more on exactly what you're talking about. But maybe that was what you were asking.
So I see another question on, is there research to demonstrate effectiveness of social emotional learning in the juvenile justice system? So we do talk a lot about social emotional learning in the report. We talk about it as a way to integrate, or we think it should be integrated within the rest of the curriculum and within all of the activities in a classroom and in a school environment. If you all have heard of the organization CASTLE, the Center on Social Emotional Learning, they're based out of Chicago, and they've done a lot of research. They're working with a number of school districts on developing social emotional learning standards to be integrated with a Common Core, and how to really promote social emotional learning school-wide and throughout a school's curriculum. So we do talk about it in the report. I'm not sure exactly if there's research on it in a juvenile justice system, but in the juvenile justice chapter, we do have recommendations for how to improve correctional education and outcomes for youth in those correctional settings. And obviously, one of the recommendations we make is on creating an environment that promotes social emotional learning, that creates more strengths-based competencies in students. And so we do see that as something that should be implemented in all education settings, not just in traditional public schools.
Do we have some other questions that individuals would like to pose? Or waiting for that, I'd like to just suggest one other thing that possibly we could respond to, and maybe some of those that are on the line might want to weigh in on this as well. And that is that although I think some of these recommendations have been are in effect in schools, many of them still are siloed into different discrete initiatives rather than becoming part of what you describe as a comprehensive system. I know in my experience, I've seen a lot of schools that have many of these kind of interventions, but they are not well coordinated into one comprehensive system that applies to all students and all faculty. So I don't know if that's the experience of some on the line, but if it is, or if you have a different experience, why don't you just let us know. I see that Sarah is typing. I think Sarah?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Sarah is typing now, so we'll wait to see what Sarah has to offer. A couple of people are typing now.
I also, while we're waiting for those couple questions, I also want to respond to Nora on her note on how there's a lot of recent high-profile cases of very young children, children in kindergarten, preschool being suspended or expelled, and how the report addresses those students, or if there's any recommendations for students in the primary grades or younger. And when we were embarking on this project, one thing that we had to consider was the breadth and scope of the work that we were going to undertake. And while we understand that a lot of the issues stem from students in in the lower grades, in kindergarten, first, second, third grade, and that a lot of what happens in those early years affects what happens in the later grades, we had to kind of narrow the scope of this project and this work. And so the report, while acknowledging that, really focuses on middle and high school, so the secondary school years.
But I think
that a lot of what we talk about in the report is very applicable to those elementary grades. A lot of the Conditions for Learning chapter that talks about engaging learning environments really applies to students and schools at all levels. Similarly with student support teams, and the role of behavioral health specialists also really applies to schools and students at all of those grade levels.
I'd like to just, while we're waiting for some of the others to finish typing in their questions, I'd just like to take us back to a few years ago. The National Mental Health Awareness Day focused on exactly what Nora is talking about here, the needs of children in early intervention. And one of the surprising statistics that was released focused on the number of suspensions and expulsions from preschool as opposed to high school. And although it seemed kind of counterintuitive at the time, it far exceeded the number of suspensions and expulsions in high school. So this really kind of points us to this idea that if we see those kinds of issues in preschool, then we understand what through an educational pipeline is going to be hitting our public schools, and really focuses on this idea that it has to be a school community approach to addressing some of these issues, not just responding to them when these issues hit us in the school age years. Absolutely. Thank you, Nora, for bringing that up.
So I see we have a couple questions on social emotional learning and those interventions that could support students in creating or developing those competencies in terms of what are some creative or effective ways for providing those interventions, as well as how to do that given the limited funds that schools and districts currently have. So Emily, do you want to talk a little bit about the strategies and creative ways, and then we can talk a little bit about the funding opportunities that we reference?
Sure. So, some of I think what's great about social emotional learning is that it can be really easily incorporated into what is already taking place in the school building. So kind of looking at the different components of social emotional learning, one is to kind of enable students to kind of be more in touch with their feelings and better able to manage their own behaviors. And so a lot of that is through kind of self-reflection exercises, or a lot of groups or a lot of educators are implementing kind of a morning circle routine where they have everybody kind of sit down at the beginning of the day and kind of talk about what happened over the weekend, for example, or if a big news event happened, kind of what happened, what are they feeling. It provides an opportunity and a place for students to kind of talk about emotions that they're experiencing, conflicts that may be kind of brewing, and help work those out before they escalate. and also helps with communication skills. I mean, another piece of social emotional learning is teamwork and positive relationships with others, and that can be forged through group projects, having opportunities for different students to take on leadership roles in group settings, reading circles, that kind of thing. But again, just providing opportunities for students to talk about the feeling, for educators to model discussing feelings and how to manage their emotions. So, a teacher might say, in response, if the classroom's acting out, I am feeling very upset right now, or I'm feeling a certain way, and kind of helping to model that for their students, and then kind of expecting that same type of openness and discussion among the students themselves. And in terms of funding opportunities, we provide, I think Nina mentioned, but one of the collateral materials that we developed was a funding map to support different aspects of school discipline reform. And school climate and social emotional learning are certainly kind of priorities, or at least incorporated into some federal funding opportunities or public funding opportunities. There are also private foundations, like Nina mentioned, the Castle organization, and Novo Foundation, some others that have been making investments in social and emotional learning. And as it relates to other educational priorities, there might be some opportunities there. But I think the biggest piece is that it can be integrated into everyday routines and done pretty cost effectively.
And just to address some of the research questions on SEL, before I get to that, there are a number of organizations that work primarily on this issue that we, that were part of this project and part of the advisory groups, and all the conversations that were involved in preparing this report and developing these recommendations. One, as we mentioned a bunch of times, is Castle, who is actually working with a number of big city school districts to crosswalk social emotional learning standards with the Common Core standards and how to integrate that into the curriculum. Another is the National School Climate Center, and another is the Alliance for Excellent Education, which is a national policy organization here in DC that has done a lot of research on school climate recently, particularly demonstrating the return on investment of investing in these types of interventions. So those are just a number of resources for you all to kind of look at. And as you said, or as I see on the screen, a lot of the research out there on social emotional learning demonstrates that there is a reduction in student misbehavior and the use of suspensions and expulsions when social emotional learning and these types of interventions are in place. So there is a number of studies out there that we cite in the report, and that is available that does demonstrate that. And one of the other questions that we just got on the screen on how to get school administrators to work on these issues, especially with so much of the focus being at the school level and on educators and other school-based staff. So for this project and for this report, we've had a fantastic partnership with AASA, the School Superintendents Association, as well as the National Association of Secondary School Principals and Elementary School Principals. We've had administrators participate on our advisory groups. We did focus groups around the country with educators and with administrators. And we're planning to do a webinar with NEA, AFT, and the Principals Associations in another month or so, really focusing on not siloing these different groups, but making sure that teams of folks are at the table talking about these recommendations and how to implement the recommendations. And so we hope to get educators together with administrators on these webinars, involved in these conversations. And we've had a really good turnout in terms of having these folks participate, having them buy into these recommendations. And as Emily mentioned, this report is consensus-based. And so the recommendations in this report are based on agreement from a lot of these different organizations and stakeholder groups, including administrators, school-based and district-based. So I know folks were having a little bit of trouble hearing about the organizations that were involved on social emotional learning, or SEL. So CASEL is one of them. Another is the National School Climate Center, and another is the Alliance for Excellent Education. So I have a few other folks that are typing in questions right now, so we'll give them another minute or so. So we just got one question about inviting the PTIC to get the information out to parents. And so I'm not sure I'm as familiar with that group, but we've had a number of parent organizations involved in the project. And we, as well as I mentioned earlier, that we had focus groups and listening sessions with educators and administrators and behavioral health specialists. We've also held listening sessions with youth and families. So we traveled to conduct listening sessions in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, a couple different sites in Washington State, in the New York City area, here in Washington, D.C., as well as in South Dakota on a native reservation. And we wanted to really make sure that youth and family voice was incorporated, that we really listened to these folks who are most affected by these policies and practices to really get their recommendations and their feedback on what policies and practices needed to change to be more effective. But that is a great recommendation, and as we continue to disseminate the report, parents and youth and advocates are a really critical audience, and so we are looking for different ways for involving these constituencies.
And Nina, if I could just jump in there while we're waiting for these other individuals to type. We are, the IDA Partnership and the National Community of Practice on School Behavioral Health is going to be leading the development of some tools that would be ready to use at the local level to hold dialogues in these cross-stakeholder groups, to bring awareness, things that can be used by individuals wherever their sphere of influence is. If you're from an organization, if you're from a parent group, if you are a member of a team in a school district, if you're you work in the county and you need to get attention there, we're going to try to create some tools based on this report that will encourage people to talk about different aspects of this report and surface some of their beliefs and some of the willingness that they have to tackle some of this stuff together. So if you would like to be involved in that, we're just going to leave this this webinar up and just put your contact information in the chat, and we will definitely involve you. Send out a message and let you know when we're going to be developing those tools. Some of those tools will be led by individuals here at the partnership. Others will be led by some national leaders from various disciplines like school psych, some family leaders, some maybe school social workers, some community mental health workers. So they'll be led by different groups so that we get, and they'll invite participation by many groups so that we get some really good cross-stakeholder tools. So if you're interested in an extended opportunity coming from this webinar to participate in that kind of work, just put your contact information in the chat and we will definitely be in touch.
Great. So I see a couple of folks typing in right now, and one other question that we haven't addressed yet is on pre-service training for educators around these interventions, around social emotional learning and other strategies for supporting students or for better managing classroom behavior. Emily, do you want to talk a little bit about the recommendations we have on pre-service?
Sure. So the recommendations we have around pre-service training can be found in the Conditions for Learning chapter, policy statement for recommendation 2. And so we talk a lot about how educator preparation programs, whether it's traditional, university-based or alternative through Teach for America or others, should partner with local school districts to kind of develop programs and opportunities for students, for pre-service educators to learn how to better manage student behavior, effectively manage classrooms, support students' social and emotional learning, and so on and so forth. And we talk about a couple aspects of those programs that would be particularly beneficial for pre-service educators. The first of which, or one of which, is kind of developing a more expanded clinical practice opportunity for student teaching, or sometimes it's called a clinical placement. To extend that, usually it's just a semester, but to extend that maybe over a year so that students and educators in training are able to see not only kind of the development of rules and procedures and school climate, but also how that's carried out throughout the year. I think that's very powerful to help them kind of better understand how that works. We also advocate for extensive coursework related to issues of social and emotional learning, as we talked about, cultural competence, school climate. So, the coursework talks about what SEL actually is, and how they can, again, embed that within the existing curriculum. Also, ensuring that high quality, the supervising teachers are high quality so that they are able to model effective practices for educators, and that educators in training have opportunities to talk with these advisors and supervisors and kind of test out different strategies and talk about what's working and what's not, particularly related to discipline and climate and SEL. So those are just a couple of the recommendations from that chapter. But again, making the focus very intentional on SEL and these strategies for pre-service educators, because too often we've found that pre-service education focuses on instruction and content knowledge and not enough about some of the real-world strategies that educators need to have in their tool belt to be able to effectively kind of create environments where they can teach and where students can learn and where students feel supported and welcomed and have these strong relationships both among the students and then also between the students and their teachers.
And I also want to say, I mean, we're providing a very high-level overview on this webinar of a 460-some-page report with 60 recommendations, and I really encourage everyone to go to the report, because the way the report is organized across these 4 chapters is we have these broad policy statements with individual recommendations under the policy statements, but we also provide action steps for how to implement the recommendations that we provide, as well as highlight promising practices and examples from different jurisdictions around the country that are already implementing some of the things that we're recommending. So if you want to find, places that are implementing SEL, if you want to find places that have model school police partnerships in place with MOUs, like in Denver that did it this past year, that's all included in the report under each recommendation. And so it's hard on a webinar to go through it in that kind of detail, but the report does include action-oriented steps for how to accomplish the different strategies, as well as examples of places that you all can follow up with to really see how that process was undertaken in particular places. So we really encourage you all to go take a look. And we're really excited by what we see right now in the chat window, by the number of folks that are interested and excited and would like to work on the process of developing tools that are aligned with this report. So that's very exciting to see. I'm not sure we have any more questions. So if anyone has any last questions, we'd love to take that before we wrap up.
We're very encouraged that we have so many people that would like to continue to work together. It's only by getting people from different perspectives that we can really create tools that will answer these kind of needs for the field or point people in the right directions based on some of what's in the report. So this is just great, and I see there's a lot of support for some of the resources. Some of you have already checked them out, and that's great too. So yeah, please just continue to put your information if you want to continue to be involved in that chat, and that's, yeah, really, it's a very, very encouraging.
Great. So thank you so much. We really want to thank the IDA Partnership for allowing us to partner and to present this information, and really encourage folks, if you have any questions or need to be directed to particular resources, please feel free to contact myself or Emily. Our contact information is on the last slide, and we really encourage you all to reach out to us. We'd be happy to answer any questions and direct you to different organizations or jurisdictions around the country if you want that information.
Thank you so much. Nina and Emily, you've been really great partners, very, very open to really thinking about extending these invitations broadly to learn about the report, and even just your willingness to work with us on creating some stakeholder-developed resources based on the great work you've done. So I'm looking forward to really having a continuing story of this kind of collaboration, which involves all of us and all of you on the line. So thanks, everybody, for joining today. We'll leave the screen up and open for a few more minutes so you can type your information in if you haven't had a chance to and you want to be involved in follow-up. Again, thank you so much for joining, and thanks to the project for offering this opportunity.